Recently, a conversation was overheard between two elders. From the expressions visible in the casual tone, the most obvious quality to be observed was one of familiarity. It could easily remind one of Lahovsky's painting, The Conversation, whose aura of familiarity was so great that it eclipsed whatever wonder one might have over trying to guess what was being talked about in the setting that it was portrayed. What is it to be familiar with something? Such a basic question, yet it's the foundation of all connection between people. The psychologists tell us that the link between people, topics, and events is what makes meaning, and perhaps they're right. But these lines that link people and things together seem to paint an incomplete picture. They don't end at the circle that touches them, but rather they penetrate the circle and reach an inner nucleus that serves as the source of the link itself. That source is familiarity, something that is a base, no matter how far away the conversations may be. You wonder if familiarity is the same experience in other worlds. It doesn't look, for example, like ants say much more than hello when they encounter each other. They don't seem to stop very long. They don't seem to be touchstones. There appears to be nothing new that comes from the exchange as such. For us, the familiar is the space from which everything else comes. So much of art is a tradition itself of establishing action of some sort in a setting that seems familiar, at least to the subjects inside the work, as if capturing it were more important than anything else in any kind of work, even perspective in 3 dimensions. Now, even technology, the most alien and foreign thing that modern minds have ever encountered, reached in its initial stages for the familiarity of existing social conventions. And later, of course, social conventions themselves would come to revolve around technology. It was an inversion no one had foreseen. But it revolved around the idea of familiarity. So all along, it seemed, in some ways, almost natural. Despite the reduction of human expression and experience into small caricatures of ourselves and our own expressions within technology, what does it say about ourselves that whatever is stamped with the label of familiar is the thing that we somehow never challenge or question? It's as powerful a kind of human connection as any. Even in the afterlife, symbols seem to have to become familiar to us in order to be acceptable. The scene you see here is death in every sense. And yet, the way it's presented, we could feel almost there, as if we were being called into the proceedings. Perhaps what is familiar to one is familiar to others afterward. But this, of course, is not really familiar. The familiar is built partly on the recognizable, and most often also on what is pleasant or at least agreeable. There's also a class of things that are familiar and yet also strange, into which catacombs might be classified. Or perhaps a half memory, an image of something nearly recognizable, but missing what connects it for us with a sense of place. It seems familiar, but it lacks authenticity, as if we feel we were there in these images without knowing why or when. And as we go into the space of the uncanny, we find it to be a much larger region than previously imagined. For there are things that are real, and there are things that are quasi-real. And it is the inability to easily distinguish between the real and the semi-real that seems as unsettling to us as the images that create that reaction. Somehow it seems like we know that life is as precious as it is mysterious, and that it is something that we have uniquely in ourselves, and that behind the likeness of the living, falsehood and false life is a reminder of death, because it is the absence of life. And while we look at the likeness, we don't feel the presence of something living. Or perhaps it is life, but without what we know to be a part of life, the insincerity and the complexity of hiding ourselves that becomes normal in modern life. Early life, like that of children and monstrous things, is relentlessly unable to hide the impulses and feelings that are its true nature. The gist of truth, it seems, is simple, even primitive. Other familiar things are of an equally unearthly nature, and the myths that are said to contain the greatest truths are both familiar because they reflect human nature and uncanny because they show a path for overcoming it. Here is a Fra Angelico painting, a painting done by a monk in a monastery. Monasteries, one of those places both familiar and strange. A monastery is not meant to be a home, but rather a stopping point on the preparation to go elsewhere. As such, it is both familiar and strange. This is a place where one finds all kinds of things that are familiar, only to a hidden aspect of oneself. Things that one doesn't ever encounter in the routine world of daily life. Ideas that few people understand or even utter. Ideas like redemption. The ultimate escape from guilt, because it comes linked with personal transformation, is an escape where one leaves who one was. And by escaping ourselves, we also escape everything we were familiar with and enter new space. This is what some images seem to be telling us. But basically any change, even of places that seem somehow familiar, makes everything seem odd, strange, even slightly distorted. Places are not the same as they were before. Parker had British soldiers explode a wooden shed. When the pieces of the shed were collected, they were hung in a complicated template that shows a state between the original object and the end of the event itself, between a shed and an explosion. A state between two familiar conditions is shown to be something quite unfamiliar. Brings up the idea of place. Places in which everything is set up for just a temporary holding, where soon only absence is felt. Soon things go into motion, and everything acquires the character of a metaphor rather than of something specific. Like Parker's sculpture, there is a familiar feeling, but also a sense that one is suspended between realities. The idea of existing between realities is often portrayed as a kind of journey. And sometimes what seem to be the safest departures become journeys that ultimately have no return. Yet, just as often, the journey is a kind of return itself. It's not something that one knows, it's something that one feels during the travel. Which brings up the question, who will be there to greet us at the other end of the journey? whoever it is, it will mark the beginning point, the seed of everything that is familiar. That return itself is the basis of many stories, like that of the prodigal son. The experience of the travel itself, that motion from everything that was completely familiar to something less familiar, experiences and then a return itself. This marks everything that there is to recall and to share, which is perhaps what that initial conversation was about.